Hi, my name's Daisy, I'm in year 13 and today I'm going to be talking to you about UCAT top tips. I sat my UCAT last year around mid-August and I came out with a score of 3010 and band 2. And for those of you who aren't sure on what that means, the UCAT is scored out of 3600. There are 5 sections, 4 of those sections are scored out of 900 each, and one of them is scored in bands, so band 1 being the best and band 4 being the worst. Now, an average UCAT score, I would say, is around 2500 to 2600. That tends to be what the majority of people come out with each year. Now, there are obviously those that get lower and those that get higher. And when you get your UCAT score, you have to then tailor the unis that you choose dependent on your UCAT score. So I recommend starting about 5 to 6 weeks before when you book your UCAT for. So I booked my UCAT for around mid-August. So before you start your revision, about 6 weeks before your UCAT, I recommend sitting a base test. So that's a test prior to all UCAT knowledge. I mean, maybe read up on what the UCAT is, know the 4 sections, your verbal reasoning, your decision making, your quantitative reasoning and your abstract reasoning, and obviously your situational judgment. And then go onto the UCAT website and sit sort of a baseline test. Now, this test will give you raw results. It won't give you a score. It won't come out of a score of say 2500, for example, but it will give you scores out of each section. So once you've done your base test, you will come out and you will see which sections you've probably done the worst on. So for example, my worst was abstract reasoning, and it's funny because my abstract reasoning was my highest score. Out of 900, I got 870 for my abstract reasoning, so you know, it all changes. So to start off with verbal reasoning, I recommend to start reading the newspaper or to start reading magazines or books or anything, and not read them slowly like you would normally, but make sure you get really good at skim reading, because that's what you're gonna have to do in verbal reasoning. It's a very, like every section, they're all quite time pressured, but I'd say for me, I found verbal reasoning the most time pressured. You have to read quite a long passage, or some are short, some are long, but you have to read quite a lot of passages in not a lot of time, and you also have to be able to digest that information. So make sure that you get really good at that, because time is tight. Everybody has their own way of doing this section. So for me, I'd read the question, make sure I understood what it meant, I understood what it was asking me. Make sure that you're not tricked, because quite often they'll say, for example, what is not shown in the text, and obviously a lot of the time people read what is shown and then they find something and think, right, well, that's the right answer, and it's not. So make sure that you get good at also checking for them tricking you. Once you've got that, I recommend just skipping straight to the text, skimming it through. Pick out the words, pick out the keywords from the question and find them in the text. So for example, if you're talking about, I don't know, different types of houses and they talk about like a bungalow, then make sure you pick out the word bungalow from the question, skim through, and once you find that word, then read the sentence above it and below it, around it. Maybe read the whole paragraph if you feel like it's necessary, if you can't gauge the whole information. Quite often with verbal reasoning, the information isn't right there, it's informed, it's embedded into the text, so you have to really look out for that. So decision making, I came out with 700. It wasn't my best one, but it certainly is not a bad score. It's a very good score if you come out with 600 and above per section. Decision making is one of those sections where you don't realise until sort of the last minute that it is actually quite time pressured. For me, I went through quite relaxed in this section. I found it like a breather for me, but you might not, it just depends. So you're given a whiteboard in the exam. If you didn't know that, you're given a whiteboard or paper that you can write on, and I recommend using this paper especially for this section and quantitative reasoning. That's when you're going to want to use it. It will come in very handy, because you'll find that decision making is a lot of gibberish quite often, and they're trying to trick you out. So I recommend like planning it out, or as you read through, they'll give you, for some questions they give you like a long passage and you have to pick out the key information from that passage and then give answers like yes or no. Is this statement true or false? based on what you've read in the passage, and often that's quite difficult to do if you read a very long passage and it's probably going to be nonsense and you're going to have no idea. So I recommend writing that down. I'd also get quite good at sort of your mathematical like probability trees. I'd get quite good at Venn diagrams, things like that. So I think those are the main ones for decision making. Moving on to quantitative reasoning, I hated this section at the beginning. It was, along with my verbal reasoning, it was my worst, but I came out with 740 on my quantitative reasoning, so quite well. I mean, I was very happy with it, seeing that when I first did it I came out of about 500, so you know, you can improve. I think quantitative reasoning is one of those ones, like every section, one of those ones where you really have to practice. So I just do lots and lots of questions for this. Get good at picking out questions that are too difficult. Once again, this is a very time pressured section, and you're going to want to pick out the questions that are almost impossible to do. Give yourself about 30 seconds per question. Make sure you're able to digest it. Sometimes you'll just look at a question, you go, that's too difficult. You can guess an answer and flag it, and if you have time at the end, come back to it. If not, it's just a guess. I'd also say get really good at using the online calculator. When you start your revision, do not use your own calculator, because you find it quite easy to use a calculator in hand. You're going to find it a lot more difficult to use them online, so I'd get really good at using those. Practice using either the on the online UCAT website, they have quite a good representation of what the UCAT will actually look like, so make sure you get good at using that calculator. You get used to using the buttons on the keyboard, maybe even start practicing now, like not looking at the keyboard and being able to do it on the screen, because it's something that you're going to have to get used to. I'd also get really good at your mental maths. I recommend like brain training games. They're pretty good for like sections like this where you have to know your timetables, for example. I get really good at them. I'd say up to your 15 times tables you're probably going to know, or probably going to need to know. Get good at, you know, adding and subtracting in your head. It's something that you're going to have to do. You don't have time to start writing things down. Also get very good at estimating. You're not always going to have time to do calculations, but get really good at looking at answers and thinking, could that actually be the answer? Quite often you'll find that you're going to start working through each individual possible answer, but when you think about it, you will notice that in fact some of the answers are absolutely ridiculous and they couldn't be an answer. Moving on to abstract reasoning. This was my best section, but it started off as my worst, and I think this was the perfect example of practice makes perfect. You will find that at the beginning you'll notice, I can't remember the exact number of questions, but it is the most time pressured one. It's like 59 questions in like 11 minutes or something like that, and you'll be quite overwhelmed at that by the beginning. You'll see a lot of questions you've got to do and not a lot of time, but you will realise quite quickly that you'll get quicker at it, and it will be like a 1 second answer and you can get through them very quickly. So I think for this, all I can really recommend is practice. You can start, well, this is what I did. It depends how much time you have. If you give yourself 3 weeks, I wouldn't recommend this, but I gave myself 5 or 6, so I had this time. I would start, I'd get an A4 sheet of paper and I'd write every pattern that I notice. So for example, if I notice that every time there's a shape in the left, and then on the set B there's a shape in the right, I'd write that down. That's a new pattern, because you will start to notice as you do hundreds and hundreds, you'll start to notice that in fact the patterns are almost always the same, just slightly moved around a bit. So if you say they're always in the left or the right top corner, maybe in another one they're going to be in the bottom left and the bottom right corner. They tend to I'd say the main ones that you use are colour and shape and like placement of each shape in a box. Something that I used, I'm not too sure if this is going to help you, but sometimes I found that looking at individual boxes and trying to compare individual boxes didn't work for me. If you're sitting at a question and you really cannot find a pattern, I zoned my eyes out and looked at the bigger picture. So if you're looking at individual boxes and you're thinking, oh, I can't really see anything, if you zone out a bit, then you can notice that, oh, in fact, there's one in every corner, and sometimes it makes it easier that way. Once again, if you really don't know and you really cannot get an answer, you cannot find the pattern, please don't sit on it. This is where lots of people fall down. They try and sit on one pattern, and in the end they don't have time and they run out. So I recommend, if you cannot find a pattern within 20 seconds, if you can't spot it, sometimes there were ones that I just couldn't spot, but it's all about having educated guesses. So practice makes you quite good at making educated guesses. I would just guess, flag, move on. If you have time at the end, then you can go back to it. If not, you have like a half and half or a third chance of being right, so that doesn't matter. So moving on to situational judgment, the last section. Now this is an odd section. My biggest thing I would say is put the answer as what you should do, not what you would do. So as a person, you might not do something, but as a doctor and what you are guided to do or what you're told to do, then you put that. So I recommend reading the GMC's good guide for doctors or something like that, because that gives you basically all of the information that you need. Read through that, know it quite well. You'll get a gist. Some questions you'll look at them and think, well, that is very obvious. So for example, if there's a consultant comes in drunk, do you leave it or do nothing? Well, obviously you're not going to do, you have to do something. I'd say those are my main tips for each section. Talking about sort of overall, I know I said that you should start about 5 to 6 weeks earlier, and I said that that doesn't mean do thousands of questions a day and get really worked up. Obviously do 100 questions a day and call it a day there. But I'd say when you start getting to your sort of 3-week, 2-week mark, I'd then say start really ramping it up. So within sort of 3 or 4 weeks, I was doing a mock test a day. And I think what's really important about the mock tests is not necessarily just doing the mock test for your practice, but also working through them after. So I recommend Medify. If you can pay for Medify, that's absolutely brilliant. I paid for the 1 month, I think. If not, then you can get questions on the UCAT website for free, which are also super helpful. But bear in mind that you are only given 4 mock tests on the UCAT website, so make sure you use them wisely. I recommend doing 1, so say do A at the very beginning of your revision for your base exam. I'd then say do B and C in the middle, maybe at the 4-week and 3-week mark, and then I'd say use 1 for a couple days or a week before, just to see how you're doing. One thing about the ones on the UCAT website, I'm not sure if you will find it the same, but I found them super difficult. I found them so much more difficult than the ones on Medify. I think that the ones on the UCAT website is in the layout. I think it's a very accurate representation of what you will be doing. It basically looks the exact same, but in terms of some of the practice questions, I'd say they're quite hard. So don't let that put you down if you're doing really, really well on Medify and then you come out and you do it on the UCAT website and you don't do as well. That is fine. That will happen. Don't let that put you down or panic you. So at the 2-week mark, I'd say start doing 1 or 2 mock tests a day and go through them. So this will be quite a stressful time. Please make sure that you also give yourself time to relax, because it is the 6 weeks and I know you're going to feel like you're missing out, but remember, it's all worth it. And then for me, at the 1-week mark, I was doing 2 mock tests a day and I was giving myself an hour break in between them. And then I'd make sure to go through them. Going through them is so important because you can reflect on where you've gone wrong, and it obviously gives you the opportunity to pick out extra patterns, for example in abstract reasoning, that you wouldn't have seen, and then you can write them down if that's what you choose to do. A couple days before, I did a mock test. I think I came out at the time with 2,900, and for me, I would have been very, very happy with that. So the day before, I didn't do any mock tests. I just did a couple questions in the question banks. I think that the question banks are very, very helpful, but I'd be aware that on the practice ones you're not timed, so either time yourself or only do the ones under time conditions. Also, you will find that some of the practice mock sections, so for example practice quantitative reasoning section, you'll find that certain ones are easier or harder. So I mean, I found them useful at the beginning for practicing, but I think that when you get to sort of the 2-week mark, I would put them down and I would do only mock tests, but apart from the couple days before, because I think you want to relax. There's no point panicking. For me, it was sort of what's done is done now. The day before, there was no point doing a mock test, and if I came out really bad, then I'd panic, and you don't want to do that. So you just do a couple questions, make sure that you keep yourself alert. So on the day, I had my test at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, so I did whatever I wanted in the morning. I did a couple questions per section, and then I just went, and I didn't do any mock tests that day. I think that lots of people fall into the habit of doing like 2 mock tests a day, and when it comes to the actual day you want to do a mock test, I really recommend not doing that. You're going to be very tired. It's a very tiring exam. Once you start doing mock tests, you'll realise that. One last thing that I'd like to say, one of my biggest tips actually, because it helped me the most, was practice when you're going to sit your exam. So what I mean by that is I sat my exam at 2 o'clock, August the 24th, whatever the date was, and every day I would do a mock test at 2 o'clock or around that time. It's quite odd, but you'd be surprised at how much it sort of trains your body clock to be most active at that time. Because if you're always sitting exam at 9 o'clock at night, that's not very realistic as to when you're going to be sitting it. So I replicated every day. I would replicate how it would be for me in the actual exam. So I'd eat at a certain time and then do the exam at 1:30 or 2, round about then. So yeah, I'd say that they're all of my tips and tricks. I really hope they help everyone, and I wish all of you the best of luck.